And welcome back to another session. I hope you were well. In the session I covered yesterday, the previous one, I started with a concept of learning how to let go. The title was Deliberate Forgetfulness. And so I'm going to build on that concept in the reversed role. When we talk about depression, for many people, depression is partly perhaps a consequence of what happened to us in the past. There is no better place to start than family. Familial issues play a strong role in depression. It's a difficult one to accept, it's a difficult one to contend with, and it's a difficult one to heal from. And here's the reason. The idea that someone who is supposed to have loved you, someone who is supposed to have cared for you, someone who brought you into this world, someone who you even shared this world with, having been brought into this world, could do such a thing as to create, um, whether by errors of omission or commission, to create a scenario where um, their actions, their words, and their deeds, their behaviors um, have a ripple effect years and years and years into the future on you and your well being, is something that most people struggle with. Generally speaking, we tend to hope and believe that our family is good. We don't get to choose our family, we get to choose our friends. And one of the struggling aspects of depression for some people on the familial level is if a friend were to do you harm, if a friend were to breach the conditions of the relationship, assuming those conditions are made known, if a friend were to continually breach the rules that you set and the boundaries that you lay bare, as hard as it might be, you might say, this has to stop. Or you might even go as far as saying, I'm done with this. This is over. And you walk away for your sanity, for your peace of mind, and for your well being. You can do that because there is no spiritual connection, there is no familial connection, and there is no deep bond by blood, soil, or other with said person. As painful as it might be, it's conditional. The family is most of the time is the closest representation that we might have to what we believe when we talk about the concept of unconditional love. Now, yes, for most familial relationships, it's still conditional, but there is a spiritual unconditionality connecting both parties or several parties by virtue of birth. Now, you've heard me say that you are a spiritual being. You live in a physical body. You've been gifted with an intellect, and how you use your intellectual faculties determines your emotional state, your psychological state, and the experiences that you go through in life. However, because you are not making yourself, you have to be birthed or born of man and woman. And therefore, there's a sense that your father or your mother is the spiritual representation of what is divine, if you believe in such divinity. And that whatever we look up to as being at the pinnacle of perfection and bliss, some people call it by different names, wherever that thing might be, that thing manifests itself in a physical form through father and mother. Now therein lies the complications, because the expectation is perfection, because this divine being should be perfect. But when we see our parents, we see flaws and failures. It gets worse. For some of us, we don't even know our parents because, I guess, to put it just very directly, they refused to play the role that they should have. They either walked away or they gave you away, or they were called home to glory for whatever reason. And so what we start to struggle with is, for some people, the idea of pure love, which should have come from father or come from mother. And that love doesn't mean it's actually unconditional per se. It just means that it's necessary for your long-term interest, and it's sufficient for your long-term interest. And along the way, it would have several variations in its palette, its color. One would be love and kindness, and then sometimes it would be discipline and boundary setting. But nonetheless, what you find is that the father and mother representations, recognizing that we are flawed individuals, has flaws. And therefore there are things that are done to us, or there are things that are done for us, or there are things that are done with us in mind, but turn out in the short term to have been reasonable, but in the long term do more damage. It might surprise you to hear that some of that damage comes from excessive love, helicopter parenting, being way too close, raising your children on this ideology that they are the most important thing, and this concept of solipsism, and raising your children in the idea that the most important focus should be about how you feel and your pleasures, hedonism. You heard me talk about consequentialism, or about maximizing utilitarianism, and the whole idea of do what makes you feel good. And the whole idea of duties and responsibilities and sacrifices and dedication and grit are not provided as part of the banquet, the buffet of life's opportunities. And so most of us grow up with good fathers and good mothers, but we were, unfortunately, despite being given a very solid operating system, we had a software installation that was flawed. It had a bug, whatever that bug might be. And in that bug, we find flaws. And that bug actually just stops it from operating at its maximum in its purest form. And so for many of us, the familial damage that we have is strong enough to cause depression. Because as we go into the world and as we contend with the world beyond being adolescence and teenage age, and we become adults and we become independent, we start to look back and we realize, well, there were certain things that were done by people that loved us. And they were done sometimes in love, with love in mind and for love, but turned out to be limiting in the long term. And so if you want to understand depression, and if you want to overcome depression, in addition to what I covered previously, which is just let go, you have to recognize the role that family played in that journey. It could be an extended family, it could be an immediate family, it could be your father, it could be your mother, it could be your brother, it could be your sister. Infighting between families is not uncommon. You know, the very first family, if you believe in a particular theological perspective, were two brothers. One killed the other out of jealousy, out of resentment, out of envy, out of hatred, and out of failure to live up to his best self, and therefore look into another and you might say trying to covet what another person has or had. So in the first family, the entire family was reduced by 25% because one person took out the other. So this infighting between family members is not something new. And I think for a lot of people, the need to feel important, the need to be loved, the need to be accommodated, the need to be respected, the need to be welcomed, the need actually to know that you were kind and loving can be so powerful that we just don't know how to say, fuck off. And I can't say that in a more direct way. That we can't say to people who have actually hurt us and continue to hurt us, continue to harm us with their words, with their deeds, with their actions. We can't say fuck off the way we would to friends. And we can't do that because there's a familial line, there's a blood, there's a spiritual connection. It's as though we're indebted to this family because we were born into the family. We don't get to choose our family, we choose our friends. And we tend to find, and most people will see this, that the joy and the happiness they have in life, most of it comes from friends. Less of it comes from family. Now, that might be different for you, but in the majority, because we choose our friends, and because we can unchoose or deselect our friends, we don't tolerate certain behaviors. Whereas with family, we tolerate certain behaviors because we cannot bear to break that cord, despite the umbilical cord being broken at birth, which we're spiritually connected. And as part of the spiritual healing of depression, a time has to come, and it might be now, whereby you say, I'm going to cut this cord spiritually with family, my mother, my father, my brother, my sister, my extended family, even my community, because the suffering that I'm left with by virtue of their actions and activities, deeds, actions, words, is so powerful, is so unbearable, that I have a duty to myself to be my best self, and I can only start that process by disconnecting. Now, one of the simple ways is you change environments. Environments are just as important as your purpose. And most people's purpose will never be fulfilled because they are in the wrong environment and they're around the wrong people. Or you can't do that, you're not good enough. And you're reminded of your flaws and your things you've done wrong for years, eternal, in perpetuity. And therefore, your self-image and your self-concept comes from the repetitions of things that were said and done to you, and therefore you make progress 2 steps forward and 4 steps backwards, and 1 step forward and 3 steps backwards, and after many years of trying, you're exhausted and you are effectively depressed. You're anxious. The reason is simple. The treadmill of life that you're walking on is moving backwards at a faster pace than you can walk. And for most people, that reverse treadmill is family. It's familial history. It's familial past experiences. It's familial words. Sisters and brothers and nephews and nieces, and it just brings you down. Therefore, if you want to heal from depression, you've got to learn how to forget, and you have to learn how to move on. You can say, I forgive you completely, or you can choose not to say it, but you can forgive in your heart. You bless people. I have said in sessions prior that the opposite of love is not hate. You can't hate people who've done wrong to you. You just have to learn how to be indifferent. You have to actually go beyond even learning how to be indifferent. You have to be indifferent. One of the ways is you learn how to forget. You let go and you let God. And you choose to accept the fact that whilst you may be of a family, you are not from that family. The family was a vessel. The mother and father served as a vehicle to bring you into this world to experience this opportunity called life. Your indebtedness to them has a time limit. You can't keep paying over and over again. And one of the things I've realized as I observe different families is how much of a stronghold this is. You're going to hear me in sessions later this week, perhaps, if I can. I'm going to talk about being stuck. And one of the things I'm going to talk about being stuck in is frozen childhood. How I meet people who are 50 and 60 and 65 and 40 and 30, and they talk about things that happened when they were 7. And the emotions are so powerful that you can see the physical representation as they reiterate or replay something that happened 40, sometimes 30, sometimes even 50 years prior. And there's a part of me that thinks, just like Lot's wife, you've been frozen in time. I'm going to talk about frozen childhood in later sessions, but let me conclude today's session as follows. One of the, perhaps in my opinion, the sections of the biblical chapters that I thought was rather callous and rude, and recognizing that I say this with utmost respect, but one of the sections that I thought was callous and rude was where the master was told, your mother and your brother are waiting for you. And he replied and said, who is my mother and my brother and my father or my sisters? Those around and those who do the will of the Father, in other words, who do the will of God, these are my mothers and brothers and fathers and mothers. So he was, I wouldn't use the word disowning his family. He was simply saying there's something more divine than family. And those who honor and do the will of the Father or God, they are my brothers. Now, what I found to be slightly cold about it was, despite me saying and explaining how you have to learn how to let go, it hurts. There's something painful about it. You can't admit that it's not something, that it's something you do easily. This is not just a pop a bottle of champagne and pop, you've forgotten all about them. You have memories, you have histories, you have experiences, you have love in your heart. And to say, these are not my mothers and my brothers and my sisters, but these are my mothers and my brothers and my sisters, is hard. But you have to do it. And there is wisdom and there is truth in that process. You have to look to those who honor you, and you have to look to those who share the same expectations of your success as you do. And for those who don't, whether they are born of flesh or born of another person's flesh, you have to learn how to let go. And until you get a handle of the familial histories and how this applies to your depression, you will continue to suffer. Many a times I have seen great people and good people, loving people and kind people, they just cannot disconnect. They have horrible mothers, horrible fathers, indifferent mothers, indifferent fathers, difficult sisters and brothers. I mean, just a nightmare. And this happened for many, many years. And so their self-image and self-identity is void of true love. I'll end with a verse that I think most people should take to heart. And this is why, as I conclude this entire chapter of conversations and of understanding and conquering depression, I'm going to talk about spirituality and the Judeo-Christian values. But one of the verses I'll leave you with is as follows as I end today's session. It says, you were wonderfully and fearfully made. That you were wonderfully and fearfully made. That is important if you want to find life. Despite the shortcomings you might have, physical, mental, psychological, you were made with perfection in mind. Whoever the artist was that constructed you, and that artist is not your father or your mother or your step-parents, whoever made you for a special purpose, a unique purpose. And the moment you tap into that purpose, there is some understanding of the scales falling off your eyes because you start to come into contact with who you are, your purpose. So, whatever familial history you might have, good, bad, or indifferent, recognize that you have a duty to self. And one of those duties is for you to live life. You only get one of it. And to live life in a manner that when the story ends and you have the final full stop at the end of that chapter, you just look back at life and say, whoa, whoa. Most people will not have that experience because they live life with regrets, in regrets, looking backwards, never being fulfilled, replaying experiences from the past, judging themselves and showing no love or peace or mercy or grace towards themselves. And I would just encourage you, sometimes it has less to do with everything around you. Environment, work, health, well-being, physical, sleep. It has more to do with things in your family that you haven't let go of. The great writer says, and the sins of the fathers will live up until the third and the fourth generations of those that follow the father. And so for some people, there is a generational suffering that is taking place. Sins of other people, not yours, but other people. And the only way you get past that is you forget, you let go, and you move on. Now, I hope today's session has been useful.